Let's see here. All of that said, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Madeline Yanov, the proprietor of Time Travel Genealogy. She brings over 30 years of extensive genealogy experience, specializing primarily in American research. Given that many Americans are descendants of immigrants, she possesses a deep understanding of European genealogy with a primary focus on Irish, British, Slovak, and Russian ancestry, as well as some German. She has been instrumental in locating and facilitating reunions between adoptees and their birth parents. In her previous career as a paralegal, Madeline also specialized in discovery for legal cases. Madeline has devoted a great deal of her time as a volunteer, as many of us and you in the room have. She has volunteered at the Oakland, California Regional Family History Center, and since 2011 has been actively involved as an indexer on FamilySearch.org. She also held offices on the board of directors for the Contra Costa County Genealogical Society. And presently, she holds the title of President Emeritus of the Society. So now from her home office to you via Zoom, she is in the Bay Area. Please join me in welcoming Madeline Yanov.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm very delighted to be here tonight. And tonight we are going to continue our talk about ancestral road trips. We're going to explore the routes that your ancestors took to reach the West during the 19th century. That is, if my computer will work. There we go. This is the second part of the talk. We covered part one about 6 months ago, and this is going to offer a picture look at American migration from about 1820 to the late 1800s. I'm not going to cover every route, but I am going to focus on the major ones. And if you've had a chance to look at the handout, you'll see that this is a real crash course in migration. Now, many of you may already hold pieces of this history through family stories or heirlooms or diaries that your ancestor passed on. And I hope tonight's talk is going to help you connect those treasures to the places that your ancestor traveled. My goal is to introduce you to the key routes, deepen your understanding of the areas your ancestor went through, and point you to records that you can use to continue your research. So stories of Western pioneers are often painted in romantic lights. You know, you have the wagon trains bravely crossing rivers and climbing mountains on their way to the new promised land. The image on this slide shows a wagon train just about to cross the Rocky Mountains. There's no danger in sight. It's a very peaceful scene. But was the westward migration really that peaceful? Or was it more like this? This is the theatrical movie poster for John Ford's 1950 movie, Wagon Master. Now, that's the film that inspired the TV series Wagon Train. Now, I remember growing up watching Wagon Train. And little known fact, Ward Bond was actually in the movie and the TV series. So this poster is promising that there's going to be love on the trail, or danger, or adventure. But which idea is the right one? What was life really like? Well, with so much of life, the truth falls somewhere in the middle. You're going to have moments of beauty and peace mixed up with conflict and ugliness. We're going to start with the Louisiana Purchase, which inspired the Lewis and Clark expedition. Then I'm going to tell you why Manifest Destiny provided the driving force for people to move across the country. You're going to find out that the same reasons that made people move from the East Coast into the interior also were at play to move out west. But you're going to find a new type of pioneer that came along that wasn't really in the East Coast migration. We're going to talk about prairie schooners and hand carts, two modes of transportation, what your ancestor had to do to prepare for the journey. And then we're going to get into the actual trails themselves. The Santa Fe Trail, the Old Spanish Trail. We're going to talk about the Trail of Tears, the Oregon and California Trail, the Mormon Pioneer Trail, and some minor trails that were still historically important, like the Overland Trail or the Bozeman Trail or the El Camino de Real Trail. Then we're going to switch over to the Intercontinental Railroad and how that affected the country. We're going to finish off by me talking about a couple of programs that you may find helpful in mapping your ancestors' routes. And I'm going to leave you with some tips to keep in mind when you're researching. So any study of American migration to the West has to start with the Louisiana Purchase. Now, most people think the Louisiana Territory was owned by France, and that's true. But in 1800, it had been under Spanish control, and the territory passed from Spanish to French control under Napoleon. Now, before 1800, American merchants had an agreement with Spain. They could ship their goods down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans, and then from the port of New Orleans, move their goods. So when France gets the land and New Orleans, they start restricting US access. And tensions start rising immediately. In fact, some political leaders like Alexander Hamilton even talked about going to war against France because they wanted to reserve what they called the right of deposit. Now, Thomas Jefferson knew that the young country could not afford a conflict with France. So he sent James Monroe, the future president, and Robert Livingston, one of the founding fathers, to Paris to talk to Napoleon. And they wanted to buy New Orleans and part of Western Florida. They were authorized to spend up to $9.37 million. And to everyone's surprise, Napoleon, who's desperate for funds to keep his wars in Europe going, he offers the whole territory, all 828,000 square miles, for $15 million. Now, the price was considered too steep at that time. Remember, this is only 20 years after the Revolutionary War ended. We did not have that much money. So the United States had to borrow the money, and they had to borrow heavily. Monroe and Livingston found two banks in Europe that would loan us the money at 6% interest. Now, most Americans were opposed to that idea. Members in Congress thought that the country already had more land than it could manage. And even Jefferson started doubting, whether or not this was a good idea. He said he had stretched the Constitution until it cracked. And there were no specific borders drawn. We did not have a border between the northern part of the territory and Canada until 1813. But as the borders were drawn and Americans started moving west, the impact of the Louisiana Purchase became very clear. It doubled the nation's size. It secured vital trade routes like New Orleans, and it set into motion the Great Western Migrations. Now, Jefferson wanted this land mapped, and he needed to send a team out there, but he didn't know who he could really trust to lead it. So he chose his personal secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, who brought along his good friend, Lieutenant William Clark. They co-captained the expedition, which was called the Corps of Discovery. Now, the stated purpose was to explore and map the land, but there were other reasons for going and exploring this land. One was to find a Northwest Passage water route to the Pacific. And another one was to establish an American presence in that land before foreign powers could claim it. So the expedition set off from St. Charles, Missouri, May 21st, 1804. You had Lewis, Clark, 27 soldiers, a French and Indian interpreter, a boat crew, one of Clark's slaves by the name of York, and one of Lewis's dogs, a Newfoundland named Seaman. By the winter of 1804, they reach Washburn, North Dakota, where they build Fort Mandan. And it's there they meet a French fur trapper by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau. And he is there with his pregnant Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. They hire Charbonneau, and his wife, who later gives birth along the trail, accompanies him. By November of 1805, they see the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And it's later that month, they set up winter camp near Astoria, Oregon, where they construct Fort Clatsop. Now they're going to stay at Fort Clatsop until March, where they begin their trip home. Now they briefly split up near the Continental Divide, but reunite where the Yellowstone and the Missouri River meet. They take the Missouri River down south and they reach St. Louis on September 23rd, 1806. Now, this is a very simplistic map of their journey. It highlights some of the main points and stops along the way. We have St. Charles, where they left from, going up the Missouri River, up to North Dakota, where they build Fort Mandan and meet Sacagawea, and then traveling east until they get to Oregon and build Fort Clatsop. Now, on the way back, as I said, they split up around the Continental Divide because Lewis wants to explore the Marias River area. And so you see there's sort of a fork there. They reunite, as I mentioned, where the Yellowstone and the Missouri River meet, and take the Missouri River back down to Missouri and end up in St. Louis. Altogether, they had been gone 2 years, 4 months, and 2 days. Now, the importance of the expedition is in your handout. If I were to say that, it would make this long presentation even longer. But I think you should take a look at it. Now, you cannot go west without the idea of manifest destiny. In the 19th century, the idea of manifest destiny became a driving force behind American expansion. It was coined in 1845 by a magazine editor by the name of John O'Sullivan. And it upheld American exceptionalism by claiming that God had destined the United States to expand and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, this belief was used to justify the removal of Native Americans from their homes, and it also prompted territorial expansion. Now, many people believed that the natives did not deserve to stay on their land, that they needed to be moved because there was the belief that they were inferior to white European settlers and they did not know how to care for the land. And so that was a driving force behind the idea that we were going to open up this land for settlers to go to. Now, before the westward pioneers came, the land had already seen a lot of people. It saw trappers and explorers and mountain men, and of course, native tribes. And many of the same factors that pulled people from the East Coast into the interior of the country were at work here. You had your farmers wanting more land, you had city dwellers wanting more space, you had people chasing better job opportunities or adventure. That was the same for the westward migration. But you also had a new type of pioneer coming. And these were people fleeing religious persecution, the Mormons. You had soldiers, people chasing gold or silver, miners, logging companies, railroad men, authors of immigrant guides, and entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs like Sam Brennan. Now, Sam's sort of an interesting case because he was in California at the time gold was discovered, and he heard these rumors. So being an enterprising young man, he goes and buys up all the supplies that a miner could use. He cornered the market on the mining supplies. And then once he corners the market, he now starts publicizing the fact that gold was discovered. And if you want to go to try your luck of finding gold, you have to go to Sam to buy the supplies. He made a fortune. And then there's Levi Strauss, who moved to San Francisco in 1850 to sell wares to gold rush miners. He had a dry goods store. And he started selling pants made from canvas, and he made history by adding metal rivets to the denim pants. And we still buy his Levi's today. John Studebaker was a wheelbarrow maker. And he left California. He had made a lot of money. And he had left California to go back to Indiana, which was his home. He joined the family business at that point. Now, the family business was making wagon wheels, specifically for wagons going on the Oregon Trail. So he took his money and his knowledge and eventually turned that wagon making business to automobile making, hence the Studebaker. And then we have Henry Wells and William Fargo, who offered banking in frontier towns. I mean, up to this point, if you wanted to go to a bank and safekeep something or put your money there, you had to go to a medium-sized town or a large city. They went out to the frontier towns and even the mining camps, so miners could have a place to put their money and their gold. And then later, they offer stagecoach services to frontier towns. And finally, we've got Samuel Clemens. He started out chronicling mining camp life. He was a reporter for the San Francisco Call. And eventually he becomes a celebrated author. So the West wasn't just made up of farmers and ranchers. It was a place of opportunity, invention, and adventure for some of these pioneers. Here we see two types of transportation out west. You've got the prairie schooner on the left and the handcart on the right. Now, the prairie schooner was the preferred wagon to travel on the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and also the Mormon Trail. And as you can see, it's crowded because you've got all the furniture that someone is, going to take to their new home. Actually, this wagon is half empty, and I'll show you why in a minute. But you could not have people staying and living in the wagon like you see in the movies, unless you're a very, very small child, because there's no room. Your whole household is in that wagon. Now, the handcart was in operation on the Mormon Pioneer Trail from 1855 to 61. And as you can see, not much can be carried in it, not like a wagon. And the only protection against the weather is a small tarp. Now, I want to quickly talk about the difference between covered wagons. You have the Conestoga wagon, which is the wagon on the right, and the prairie schooner, which is on the left. The Conestoga wagon was mainly used out east and on the Santa Fe Trail. It was 6,000 pounds, so you're talking 3 tons. It was a convex box about a little under 9 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide, usually driven by a team of 6 to 8 horses or 12 oxen. This is what went on the Great National Road, on some of the other roads that we talked about in part 1. It did not go on the Oregon Trail. The prairie schooner went on. Now, sometimes people called that a Conestoga wagon, but it was not. The prairie schooner went on the Western trails, and it weighed 2,000 pounds. So it was a third as heavy as the Conestoga wagon. It was basically a farm wagon that from afar, the canvas might look like a ship's sails. That's why they called it a schooner, a prairie schooner. But it was a little between 9 and 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and the sides were about 2 feet high. It was driven by teams of oxen, 2 to 4 oxen, and you would have a drover or a teamster guiding the animals along. This wagon could cross deep streams, and it could cross high mountains. The Conestoga was too heavy. So if somebody, writes, if you have an ancestor that said, oh, we took the Conestoga wagon to Oregon or to Utah, they may have called it a Conestoga wagon, but there's no way that that wagon could have actually made it across those mountains. Now, your ancestor had to reach their disembarkation point by early April, and that's so they could leave by mid-April. And they needed to leave no later than mid-April so they could reach their destination before winter set in. Because remember, it took 4 to 6 months. A late start could be deadly, as the Donner Party tragically learned. Now, settlers packed everything that they would need: food, tools, household items, everything, as we saw in the picture of the wagon. There were few opportunities to replenish everything along the way, so they had to take everything. Now, this slide shows just a small part of the foodstuffs that they had to bring on the trip. The food rations for a family of 4 would include 120 to 200 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of bacon, 15 pounds of cornmeal, 10 to 15 pounds of rice, an early form of baking soda. You would have salt, you would have sugar, you would have, for those that drunk coffee, 5 to 15 pounds of coffee, 1 to 2 bushels of dried fruit, and up to 2 bushels of dried beans. Now, the wagons couldn't weigh more than 2,000 pounds. The food I just mentioned for a family of 4 typically weighed between 1,300 and 1,800 pounds. So that's going to leave very little space for non-food items. Now, resourceful pioneers might save some space by sewing pockets in the canvas hood or installing false floors to store extra things. But they couldn't go over the weight limit, because if they did, the wagon was going to struggle to cross a river or to climb the mountains. A typical day for your ancestor began at 4 a.m., where the men would gather the animals and start hitching the teams up while women prepared breakfast. The train would start moving about 7 a.m., and it usually covered 12 to 15 miles in a day. There was usually a midday break for a midday meal, and the train would stop moving for the night about 7 p.m. Life on the trail was extremely rough. You had you had 1 out of every 10 people dying on the route. So 10% died, and they would die from disease, accidents, floods, storms, and other hazards. Unlike the movies, which would make you think that they died from conflicts with the Native Americans. But 1 out of every 10 people never made it to their destination. Now, often a wagon train would meet a late spring storm or an early winter storm. Most of the pioneers were not used to the frontier, and they were inexperienced in handling firearms or dealing with the hazards. And remember, a lot of these people came from small towns or even cities, so they're not going to know how to deal with the hazards that happened on the trail. You know, hazards like dust storms or floods or swarms of insects. They were very inexperienced. In fact, it's surprising that only 10% died, to be honest. Now let's go on the trails themselves. The first trail we're going to talk about is the Santa Fe Trail. It connected Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The trail opened in 1821 with peak years between 1821 and 1849. It was 900 miles long, and it went through Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Now, why did they want to go to Santa Fe? Well, Santa Fe at that time was a very bustling commercial hub. It linked to routes like the old Spanish Trail to routes like El Camino Real in Mexico and in California. So it was very desirable to get to Santa Fe. So there were 2 cutoff trails from this trail in western Kansas, and we're going to see them in a minute. There was what was called the mountain route that went from Kansas to Colorado to New Mexico. And then the Cimarron Trail, which was a more direct route going from Kansas down to Oklahoma and Texas to New Mexico. And those 2 cutoffs would rejoin at Watrous, New Mexico, before heading south to Santa Fe. By 1880, this trail was replaced by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. And here are two maps of the Santa Fe Trail. The map on the left shows where the trail went from Missouri down to New Mexico. It went past Kansas City and Dodge City, and you have the two forks in the road, so to speak, which were the two cutoff trails, and then rejoining and going down to Santa Fe. The map on the right is one from Family Search, and that actually identifies which of those two cutoffs it is. So your northern one is the Mountain Trail, and the southern one is the Cimarron Trail. Now, the Mountain Trail is a little longer, but it is wetter, so there was more food for the animals if you went that route. The Cimarron Trail was 60 miles shorter, but it went over dry desert with very little food for the livestock. So it basically depended upon whether you needed to get to Santa Fe in a hurry, which trail you took. And as you can see on the map on the right, it connects to El Camino Real, which opens the way for people and goods to get down into Mexico. Now, the Old Spanish Trail opened in 1829, and the peak years were between 1830 and 1848. And it wound through New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. It connected Santa Fe to Los Angeles. Now, there were two branches of this trail to get to Utah. You had the northern or main route, and the northern one is the sort of burnt orange one. And then you had the north. You have the northern and the north. And that's the purple route. I'm going to talk about them in just a second. But the Old Spanish Trail connected to both the El Camino Real and the Santa Fe. While a lot of people took this route, many preferred the Overland and the Butterfield Overland Trail to this. So the two routes would reconnect at Green River in Utah. And then it would go down through Utah, through Las Vegas, and across the Mojave Desert in California, eventually reaching Los Angeles. And that was a journey of about 2,700 miles. This is the same map, but I want to show you the two paths of the Old Spanish Trail. The North Branch, which is the purple, went from Santa Fe to Taos, to Gunnison, to Grand Junction, to Green River. The Northern Branch, which is the sort of a burnt orange, went from Santa Fe through Durango, through Moab, to Green River. So any settlements around these particular towns, you can see where each particular route went through. So that might help you in establishing what route your ancestor may have taken to get to those towns. Now we're going to talk about the Trail of Tears, a different kind of trail. The US Constitution recognized Native tribes as sovereign nations. But from the very beginning, American leaders struggled with what they called the Indian problem. George Washington felt that Native people should adopt European ways, which meant learning English, embracing Christianity, and giving up ideas about land such as community property in favor of private land ownership. Now, there were 5 tribes that actually embraced this idea of European ways. They were the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles, and the Cherokees. In fact, they earned the nickname the 5 civilized tribes because they had embraced this idea. But the tribes were ignored by all US governments, from the federal down to the state. Now, despite the fact that these tribes embraced European ideas, settlers in those areas wanted them gone because they found out that the southeastern United States was very, very conducive for growing cotton. And the fact that gold was discovered in Georgia in 1829 didn't hurt either. So the settlers to that area pressured Congress to do something, and nothing but full removal was going to be satisfactory. There were 25 million acres in question. So in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. And what that act did is it promised that land exchanges to the Indian Territory, which we know now as Oklahoma, would be fair and voluntary. But the president at that time, President Andrew Jackson, often ignored the law. So in 1830, the Choctaw tribe was first removed. They were threatened to leave with threats of an invasion by the US Army. They went and were force marched in chains to the Indian Territory. Now, during the 1832 and 33, the Creeks, Chickasaws, and Seminoles also lost land. Now, the Cherokee tribe has a dilemma. Do they stay and fight? Or do they take money that was offered and move like some of the other tribes? They actually decide on a third option. They sue the government. No, they sued Georgia. Georgia maintained they had no legal standing against Georgia laws. And so they sued again. And this time it goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, who rules in favor of the Cherokee Nation. But President Jackson ignored the ruling. And he refused to enforce it. Now, in 1835, the Cherokee tribe are tricked into giving up their land. A small group of Cherokees signed what was known as the Treaty of New Echota. The problem was they were never authorized to represent the Cherokee tribe. The US government knew that. Congress knew that when they approved the treaty. And when the Cherokee tribe found out that they had been betrayed, the die was cast. They had lost everything. 1836, the Creeks are driven off their land for the very last time. By 1838, only 2,000 Cherokees had left Georgia. So President Martin Van Buren authorizes 7,000 soldiers to escort the Cherokees to Indian Territory. And over 5,000 of them died from disease and starvation. Now, this is remembered as the Trail of Tears. It's a symbolic trail. It spanned over 5,000 miles, and you'll see what I mean in a minute, across 12 states. So it encompassed parts of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. Even though they were promised permanent lands, the Indian Territory gradually shrunk as more and more settlers moved west. And finally, it disappeared when Oklahoma became a state in 1907. The National Trail of Tears commemoration date is September 16th. Now, as I just mentioned, the Trail of Tears is not a single trail like the Santa Fe Trail. What it is a group of trails. Each tribe followed its own path. And the map on the left shows you from where they came to what states they went through. You've got the Seminoles, which are the red line. They're taken from Florida all the way to New Orleans and then marched up through Louisiana, Arkansas, into Oklahoma. You've got the Cherokee, which are the blue. They're coming from Georgia, through Tennessee, through Kentucky, through the southern part of Illinois, into Missouri, and then Oklahoma. And then another route that they took also brought them through Arkansas. And this is true with all the others. The creeks, which are the yellow, they start on the border of Georgia and Alabama and go into Tennessee and Arkansas, or they go down through Louisiana and then up north to Indian Territory. So each tribe ended up having a separate trail. Now, the middle picture, the middle map, it shows the Indian Territory at the time of the Indian Removal Act. They had designated the Cherokees would get the northern part of the territory, the Creek and Seminoles, the middle part, and the Chickasaw and Choctaw had the southern part. And there were small little areas carved out for other tribes. Now that's 1830 when this all started. By 1889, you can see the difference in the map. All of the original tribes have their land that was promised them cut back, reduced, because more and more tribes were being put into the Indian Territory. So where you have the Creek and the Seminole, which were the middle section, the Creek now just has a very small little section. And the Seminole, you have to try really hard to find the Seminole. It is the little teeny tiny piece southwest of the Creek Nation. And you have a lot of other tribes that don't have anything to do with the original ones. Their customs are different, their traditions are different. They may have at one time been warring with one another, but now you start having new ones added, like the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, like the Comanche and the Apache. And so this map shows how the land had been reduced. So let's go on the Oregon Trail. Oregon Trail stretched for 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. It was first opened in 1841 with the first migration in 1843. It is estimated that between 250 to 650,000 people traveled on it between 1843 and 1866. There were so many people that traveled on it that it actually became the symbol of Western expansion. Now, why was this particular trail popular? Well, a lot of it had to do with publicity. The trail's popularity was fueled by newspaper accounts and guidebooks, like the Oregon Trail or the Prairie Traveler. These guidebooks would offer practical tips for pioneers, such as how to purify water, how to survive a dust storm, how to identify poisonous plants, how to fix a broken wagon axle, everything a pioneer might need to know for life on the trail. And they would also tell you what mountain passes to go through and what to expect. They were a lot like a Rick Stevens guidebook or a Fedor's travel book. Now, unlike the modern day guidebooks, some of the authors of these original guidebooks never had been on those trails at all. At best, their information was second or third hand. At the Rockies, the Oregon Trail split into two routes. The northern route went to Oregon and is known as the Oregon Trail, and the southern route went to Sacramento and California's gold fields and are known as the California Trail. This is a very simplistic map showing what states the Oregon Trail went through. We have Independence, Missouri with the start, and the Oregon Trail is the sort of orange-brown trail. It goes through Kansas and then up to Nebraska, where it goes by Fort Kearny, then into Wyoming, where it goes through the South Pass, which is the pass over the mountains, into Idaho, where it's going to split off the California Trail, and then up to Oregon. Now, remember I told you that pioneers had to leave by mid-April in order to reach their destination by the time the snows started? Well, they also had to arrive at what's called Independence Rock, Wyoming by the 4th of July in order to stay on schedule. The upper left picture is Independence Rock. And basically, it's a very large granite rock. Many pioneers that reached this location would leave a mark by carving their name or scratching their name or chiseling their name into the granite. And that left a permanent record of their journey. Today, over 5,000 names still remain, which gives people a glimpse of who passed this way and when they did. So if you look at the lower left picture, we see that R. McCord got to this point on July 4th, 1850. And the lower right picture, we see that W.H. Collins got here July 4th, 1862. And B. Garrett, well, he got here in June. I can't really tell what the date was, but it was in 1853. He got here in June of 1853. These are records your ancestors left for you. Now we're going to go on to the California Trail, separate than the Oregon. The United States was at war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848. And in the final days of the war, gold is discovered. It was discovered on January 24th, 1848 at John Sutter's sawmill. And the nugget that was discovered was about the size of a dime. Now, just days later, about 10 days later, President Polk signs the treaty that ends the war. And for $15 million, the United States gets California. Now, a lot of people don't know that there's gold in California, but we get California. And we also get a large part of the Southwest. We get Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and also Wyoming. Now, news of the gold doesn't reach the East Coast and Congress until December. Now, the gold was found in January, so it's almost a year later. And nobody knows about it until Polk, in his message to Congress, which is like a State of the Union message, announces, oh, by the way, gold was discovered in California. That sparks the gold rush and a rush of settlers westward. Now, there are three ways to get to California. You could go the route of going around Cape Horn. That's going to be the green line. You leave western seaboards and you go around the tip of South America. That is 10,000 miles long to get to San Francisco. It takes about 4 to 8 months. Now, it's the longest way to get to California. It's the most expensive and probably one of the deadliest, because Cape Horn is known for its deadly storms. Now, you could take another route through the Isthmus of Panama. That's a lot shorter. That's only 7,000 miles. And it took 2 months as opposed to 4 to 8 months. But you had to go 100 miles through a Panamanian jungle. So you'd sail to Panama, cross rivers and jungle by boat and mule, and then get to the Pacific side of Panama, catch a ship going to San Francisco, and then you end up in San Francisco. But this is a very dangerous way to go too, because you had yellow fever and malaria and dysentery in the jungle. Many people that went this route did not survive the jungle. And if you did survive the jungle and got to Panama City on the Pacific side, you were faced with cholera. So that was shorter, but it wasn't the best. So then you have the inland route, which is part of the Oregon Trail. That's 2,000 miles long, and it took 4 to 6 months. Because of the gold rush, California's population grew. It grew from 14,000 people in 1848 to 223,000 in 1852. Only 4 years to grow that much. Now, as I mentioned, the California Trail splits off from the Oregon Trail. It splits off just southwest of Fort Hall, Idaho. Now, this is near the Raft River. Now, travelers would go down, the California Trail is the red line. You would go past the City of Rocks, following the Humboldt River till it ends, where you have to cross 40 miles of desert to reach the Truckee or the Carson River in the Sierra Nevadas. Now, there were a few cutoffs that people used that were important. One was the Hastings cutoff. Now, that was supposed to be the most direct route from Salt Lake City to California. It crossed the Wasatch Range and the Great Salt Lake Desert. It bypassed a lot of established trails. Now, this cutoff promised to save 3 weeks of time. Now, this is important because, the Donner Party left late. And so they wanted to make up time. They took this cutoff to make up 3 weeks. But the terrain on this was not what was described in the guidebooks. Remember, I told you some of these authors never even went on the trails? The terrain ended up being rougher and steeper. So instead of letting them save 3 weeks, it actually cost them time. And that proved deadly. It proved deadly for the the Donner Party. Now, a year later, Mormon settlers followed the exact same route with no problem. They got there safely. The Lassen Trail branched out off the Applegate Trail. Now, the Applegate Trail on this map is the blue dotted line. And the Lassen Trail is sort of, well, I guess you could say it's sort of brownish orange. It winds past Devil's Garden and the Pitt River, leading to the Sacramento River. This was used by thousands of miners for about a decade. And the diaries of the people that went on this tell of very harsh river conditions. Even though people thought that it would save them time, it actually was longer and harder than the Truckee or the Carson routes. And then you have the Truckee River Trail, where you would cross the 40-mile desert. The Truckee River Trail is the sort of salmon color one from the 40-mile desert leading to basically Sacramento. So you would cross the 40-mile desert to the Truckee River, go west past Reno to Sutter's Fort. This was a more reliable path for many travelers. Now we're going to talk about the Mormon Pioneer Trails. There's actually two of them. I'd like to just tell you that I am not a member of the LDS Church. What I'm giving you here is just historical information. Somebody whose ancestor went on the Mormon Trail may have more information or more complete information to fill in. But in 1838, members of the Mormon Church had to flee Missouri, and they fled to Nauvoo, Illinois. And this is because of religious persecution in Missouri. In 1844, Joseph Smith, the founder of the church, and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob in Carthage, Illinois. This prompted the church leaders to decide to leave Illinois in search of a safer, better place. But they were not able to leave until February 1846, when the first wagons left Illinois. They traveled across Iowa, ending in the winter quarters near Omaha. Now, the winter quarters are basically Omaha, Council Bluffs, which are directly across the Missouri River from each other, that area. On April 5th, 1847, a company led by Brigham Young leaves the winter quarters, and they follow the Oregon Trail until you get to Fort Kearny, Nebraska. Now, generally, they remain north of the Platte River. By 1847, they had completed the journey to Salt Lake Valley in the Utah Territory. From 1846, when they first leave Illinois, to 1869, when we have the Transcontinental Railroad, about 70,000 Mormons crossed the prairie. The route was a little bit more than 1,000 miles. And here we have a map, which I think describes their route a little better. Nauvoo is the circle on the right. And as you can see, they're going to go to Iowa, follow the little dotted line, and you get to Council Bluffs in the winter quarters on the Iowa-Nebraska border. Then you go to Fort Kearny, go past Ash Hollow, Scotts Bluff, and Chimney Rock, which are national monuments, into Wyoming, where you go to Fort Laramie, Independence Rock. You leave your name scratched on the granite. You cross South Pass, which is the pass over the mountains, past Bridget, past the Needles, down to the Salt Lake Valley. And this is, as I said, a good description of exactly where the route was. By 1848, so many members of the Mormon Church wanted to travel west. A lot of them could not afford to do so. So to help, the church established the Perpetual Immigrating Fund, and that was to give loans to people to help cover travel costs. And the idea was you would promise to pay it forward to new immigrants coming. That proved very, very popular. In fact, it was so popular that by 1855, the fund was almost bankrupt. So Brigham Young initiates travel by handcart as a cheaper option. The carts were about 4 feet long with a shallow box about 9 inches high. You had 4 feet tall wheels and a crossbar in the front. So you could either pull or push the cart. Now, each cart could carry several hundred pounds. But as you can see in the picture, you're not going to be able to put a lot in. It's not as big as a wagon, and there's no cover unless you bring along a tarp to put on top of the wagon. Between 1856 and 1860, 10 handcart companies were created to help people go to Utah. In fact, in the first year alone, 2,400 people went to Utah by handcart. Now, as I said, this was more affordable than a wagon, but it offered little protection from the weather, and you couldn't carry as much. By 1861, the down and back system replaced handcarts. Church members in Utah who loaned fully equipped wagons and oxen to immigrants back east received tithing credits. This system is going to last until 1868. The down and back system eliminates both the handcart companies and traditional wagon trains to Utah. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad ends the down and back system because it makes travel to Salt Lake City faster, safer, and easier. Remember I told you there were 2 Mormon trails? Well, there's one to Southern California. Regiments of Mormon men helped fight in the war between the United States and Mexico from 1846 to 1848. And the Mormon Battalion, as it was called, was discharged in Southern California, and a lot of men began traveling back and forth from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. The Mormon Trail to Southern California, which is the red trail, connected Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. It went through Provo, down to St. George, through Las Vegas, Nevada, San Bernardino, California, and Los Angeles. Now, this route also connected to the California Trail, which is the purple trail on this map, the Central Overland Trail, which is the green, and it would end up connecting to the El Camino Real Trail, which went through Los Angeles. This is how people got to and from California to Utah. Now, there's just a couple more trails to talk about. They're small, but they're historically important. We have the Central Overland Trail, which connects Salt Lake City to Carson City, Nevada. That's the green line. It's opened in 1858 by the U.S. Army for stagecoach service. This is supposed to be a shortcut to the California Trail. It cut off 280 miles and 2 weeks off the journey. This trail eventually connects to the California Trail, which is the purple line, the Mormon Trail to Southern California, the El Camino Real, the Old Spanish Trail, and the Butterfield Overland Trail. So people took this trail to sometimes get to the others. The Butterfield Overland Trail is interesting because you can catch it in Tennessee, not Missouri. It was a little under 2,800 miles long, and it connected Memphis, Tennessee, or St. Louis, Missouri, to Los Angeles and San Francisco. It originally opened in 1857 as a snow-free alternative to the California Trail. And from 1857 to 61, the Wells Fargo Company ran stagecoach service on this route. But in 1861, Congress stops the stagecoach service because they're more interested in the Overland Trail. And in 1881, the Southern Pacific Railroad actually follows this route from El Paso, Texas, to Los Angeles. And this is the route, this is the southern route, you know. The northern route is the one that went to Sacramento. The southern route avoids all that snow. So you can catch it either in St. Louis, Missouri, or Memphis, Tennessee. There were two feeders that met western Arkansas. It then went down through Oklahoma into Texas, went by Abilene, El Paso, it went through New Mexico, into Arizona, went by Tucson, and then went up into California to Los Angeles and ending in San Francisco. This was the snow-free southern route that people took. Now, what's interesting is all of the routes we've talked about so far have been designated as historic trails, all except this one. It wasn't until 2023, just about this time, 3 years ago, that the bill designating this as a National Historic Trail was signed. So this is one of our newest trails. The Bozeman Trail only was in effect for 5 years. 3,500 people traveled on it. But if your ancestor lived and went to Montana or Wyoming, they may have used this. It existed from 1863 to 68, and it connected the gold fields of Montana to the Oregon Trail, which was in eastern Wyoming. In 1851, the U.S. Army had negotiated a treaty with several of the tribes there. This was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And the treaty basically said that the Army could put up roads and forts through this land. Now, the Lakota had moved here, the Arapaho had moved to this area, the Cheyenne had moved to this area. The Crow had claimed that it was their ancestral lands. They all signed it, but they thought it would just be for, you know, the military. Settlers start coming in, and that really, really aggravates the tribes. They see the trail as a threat to their homeland. And in fact, the Lakota leader, Red Cloud, was outraged when the Army had used the trail and encouraged the settlers to come without permission from the tribe. So he started organizing attacks on the forts. We have those listed: Fort Laramie, Fort Reno, Fort Smith, Fort Elko, or Ellis, excuse me. And this made the trail one of the most dangerous for settlers because they would attack the forts and any travelers along the route. The army had to then go and start having military campaigns, costly military campaigns, to try to control the area. In 1868, a new Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed. It brought peace. The tribes had control of the Bozeman Trail and the Powder River area. In fact, the Lakota gained legal control of the territory, and the Bozeman Trail was closed permanently. But if your ancestor were one of those 3,500 in that time period, in that area, they may have gone on the Bozeman Trail. And so you should know about the history of that. The last trail we're going to talk about is the El Camino Real. This ran from San Diego to Sonoma County. It began in 1769. As I said, from San Diego to Sonoma County, ran about 600 miles. It connected 21 Franciscan missions, 3 pueblos or towns, and 4 presidios or military forts. Now, each mission was set up to be a day's journey from the next mission. So you knew how many days it would take you to get to a place by knowing how many missions you had to go through. It was the only true road going along California's coast. Now, what's a little bit ironic is the name. El Camino Real. Loosely translated, that means Royal Road. Or if you want to translate it even looser, you could say King's Highway. Now, the last time I spoke, we talked about a King's Highway back on the East Coast that ran up and down the colonies. We had a King's Highway on the East Coast, and now we've got a King's Highway on the West Coast. We're going to switch over to the Intercontinental Railroad. Talk of a railroad connecting the East and the West went as far back as the 1830s. But it wasn't until the Civil War that Congress acted. Inspired by the gold rush and the dream of linking the nation together, Congress passes the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. They give land grants and government bonds to both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific to build this railroad. So in January 1863, the Central Pacific breaks ground in Sacramento, going eastward. They lay their first track in October of 63. In December of 1863, Union Pacific breaks ground in Omaha, and their first track is laid in 1865. A total of 1,776 miles of track is laid. Now, both railroads are going to employ immigrant and prison laborers. The Central Pacific is going to employ Chinese laborers. The Union Pacific is going to employ Irish and German and Black laborers, and they both used prison laborers. When the two lines met on May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Point, Utah, travel could now be reduced from 4 to 6 months, the time it took for a wagon train to go to the West Coast, from 4 to 6 months down to 1 week. As the poster, the Union Pacific puts out, you could go from Omaha to San Francisco in less than 4 days. you could go from New York to San Francisco in a week. By 1870, you could travel across the country for as little as $65. Now, that's not first class. $65 is much, much lower accommodations. First class tickets on a train in a Pullman sleeping car were $135 a person. Second class was $110. $65 bought you a seat on the third class or immigrant bench. And just to give you an idea, that $65 would be, that ticket would be worth about $1,450 in today's dollars. Now, there were dining cars on the trains, which would serve those who could afford it. If you were third class, you either brought your own food or you stopped and quickly ate at the station stops. The Transcontinental Railroad transformed the country. As I said, it cut travel from months to about a week, which now makes moving west more appealing. Towns are going to spring up along the rail lines. If you have two towns, let's say 20 miles apart, one town the railroad goes by, that's going to grow and prosper. The other town, which is away from the railroad, can possibly die, wither and die. Stagecoach companies are now going to connect with railroads to provide transportation. Farmers and merchants are now going to be able to reach new markets. Industry is going to boom in the West because now materials and equipment can be brought to towns by railroad. And railroads also moved troops and equipment across the West, much like the interstate highway system did a century later. Now, you may think that $65, that's a lot of money back in those days. You know, how could people afford the train? And you're right, that was a lot of money. But the train tickets were extremely affordable because the estimated cost of getting a covered wagon, animals, food for the journey, and travel necessities for a family of four in the 1850s was between $500 and $850. Just so you know, in today's dollars, that would be between $15,000 to $25,000. Most people had to borrow the money to do this, or they pooled resources together, or they relied on community funds like the Perpetual Immigrating Fund. You take that same amount of money, $500 to $850, and you can buy tickets for anywhere from 7 to 13 people for that same amount of money. So ultimately, it was cheaper to go by train. But even though we had an intercontinental railroad, there were some loose ends. The train stopped by Council Bluffs, and the train's going west from Omaha, but there was no way to get from Council Bluffs to Omaha until 1870, when a trestle is built across the Missouri River connecting Council Bluffs to Omaha. And you could get to California, but it wasn't until 1870 that you had a train line connecting Sacramento to San Francisco. So you could get to Sacramento, but it wasn't an easy, straightforward line to get to San Francisco. So you had to wait for some of these loose ends to tie up. Now we're getting towards the very end, where I want you to know about some programs that may help you map your ancestors' migration. One is free. It's called Google My Maps, and the link is in your handout. Another free one is something called Roots Mapper, used with Family Search. Roots Magic, the database, has a feature called Family Atlas, and you have to pay for that. As do if you want to use MyHeritage's pedigree map, you have to have a subscription to MyHeritage. So there's 2 free ones, 2 ones that cost money, or you could do things the old-fashioned way. Take a map out and a marker and just mark the trail that your ancestor went on, or use pushpins to mark the area. I want to leave you with just a few tips on what to keep in mind when you're researching migration. Identify your ancestors' travel companions by noting reoccurring names on documents. People generally did not go alone. They went with family members or neighbors. So these people are going to show up periodically on the trail, on documents, and they're usually, as I said, neighbors or family. Early settlers can be found in land records, censuses, and county histories. If your ancestors settled in a territory before it became a state, check the state archives because they hold territorial records. A good way to track your ancestors' migration is to use timelines to find out where they were, when. All of the trails that we talked about today have pioneer associations. All you have to do is Google, Santa Fe Trail Pioneer Association or Oregon, California Trail Pioneer Association. They all have pioneer associations, so you can get more information that way. You can find trail information at the National Park Service website, and I believe that's in your handout too. You can trace your ancestors' origins through censuses starting from 1830. Check old newspapers because newspapers would have articles about wagon train arrivals and also people who left the wagon train to settle in that town. If you have Mormon ancestors, obviously you would check the Family Search Library, but also check the Church History Library and also Brigham Young University. Cindy's List has a lot of migration resources, as does the Family Search Card Catalog and the Wiki. The Wiki is going to have articles about every single trail we talked about today, and also in part 1. And I just want to leave you with some food for thought. Can you imagine packing all your belongings in a 12 by 6 foot U-Haul and embarking on a 4 to 6 month journey with your young children? Now, you're only going to carry what you can. You have no access to stores or a map, and you're going to have to rely on yourself for your own security measures. If you can imagine that, then you can have a glimpse of what your ancestors experienced. They faced an unknown frontier without any highways, no GPS, no convenience stores to run out and quickly buy something you forgot or ran out of, no motels to go to in the middle of a rainstorm. If you were lucky, you could stay underneath the wagon and stay dry. But if the rain is coming sideways, you're going to find yourself in a sea of mud. So you can't go to a motel. And if you give up, if you get tired of this and say, that's it, I quit, I'm going to go home, there's no turnarounds. The only choice they had was to keep moving forward. And most of the people that went on these trips had no experience with the frontier or its hazards. So when thinking about this, we should be incredibly grateful to them because they went on an extraordinary road trip. If you have any more questions about this or the other migration talk, or if you find that a link in the handout does not work, I really would like to know. So contact me. The best way to contact me is my email. It's myanov4, the number 4, @gmail.com. And I'm very happy to respond and answer any questions you have. And with that, I'll answer any questions you have now.
Anyone have questions?
Madeline, I have a question.
Yeah.
I was noticing on the date when you were talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, I think that was right during the Civil War. What impact did that have on approving that and starting the construction of that?
Oh, well, I think the best thing I can do is show you from the map. No, right now, okay. The Union Pacific had a little bit more problem with laying tracks than the Central Pacific. And the reason I say that, even though they broke ground in December of 1863, they could not lay their first track until the war was over. The Central Pacific didn't have that much problem because they were mainly working out west. And the war was not as active out in California and Nevada and so on than it was in Nebraska and Iowa. So it delayed the Union Pacific actually being able to lay their first track.
Thank you.
Okay, now I got to get out of this.
Anyone else have a question? I will add a comment from what she said. Remember, a few years back, several of us from the society flew back to Salt Lake City to do research. There are other things in Salt Lake City, but that's what we were there for. But I remember everybody else was like, oh, they flew a lot. I didn't fly very often, so I wanted the window seat. And I wanted to look out and see. And one of the things on several of the flights going back and forth, as I look out and see what seemed like a whole lot of nothing, at least from an airplane. But I give all of our answers, all the people. I had someone come out in 1852 by Oxford. It's like she said, it took months. And when you think of, like she was saying there at the end, of putting everything you have in a little box and spending that time mostly walking. These people were, our ancestors were tough. They had other, things too. But just to get out here, those came to California or any of these trails, it's frankly pretty amazing. I don't think I could have done it. I mean, if you didn't have a choice, you would do it. But, and of course, there's different times. They didn't know that there would be planes and, other things that you could take. And that was the reality of the time. But the other reality I recall several times, like people from Europe, was that a lot of times you didn't know if you'd ever see your relatives back there again or not because of the difficulty. And then when the Transcontinental Railroad comes in, guess what? Now you can actually save up a few bucks and go back and see them, or maybe bring them out. It just, some of these routes, I don't think we appreciate the impact they had in many different ways. But anyway, that was just my kind of comment, thinking of some of these trails that she's mentioned. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
Madeline, can you give us your email again?
Oh, certainly. It's all lowercase. It's M Y A N as in Nancy, O V as in Victory. It's my name. The number 4 at gmail.com.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things I would like, besides her being here for our second presentation, is that I think her handouts are pretty amazing. They're wonderful resources, and I'd like to just thank you for spending all the time I knew it had to prepare those. Because you now, you say, what was that she said about that? Well, you can look in the handbook, I mean, the handout, and kind of refer back to them. So thank you very much for preparing those.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And hopefully something either in the handout or in the presentation might provide a clue, or at least maybe spark an idea where you could start to, maybe research in a different direction. I try to give people options. I try to let people know that there's a lot of sources out there, more than just Family Search or Ancestry, and this is where your ancestors' information may lie, hidden, not online.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.